The sterile, recycled air of the hospital corridor tasted of antiseptic and exhaustion. For Alara, after a 16-hour shift in the cardiac ward, it was the familiar flavor of a job well done. It was a clean fatigue, a righteous weariness earned by saving lives, by holding hands, by being the calm center in a storm of beeping machines and frantic families. This exhaustion she could manage. It was the other kind, the kind that waited for her at home, that was slowly grinding her down to dust, the exhaustion of walking on eggshells, of measuring every word, of making herself smaller and smaller until she could fit into the suffocating box he had built for her. She was leaning against the cool wall, scrolling through a message from her sister when the scent of his cologne preceded him. It was a sharp, aggressive fragrance, the kind that announced itself before its owner had even entered the room. Marcus. Her stomach tightened into a cold, familiar knot. He wasn't supposed to be here. He hated hospitals. He called them collections of the weak and the dying, places devoid of the winner's energy he so desperately cultivated. He rounded the corner, his swagger eating up the polished linoleum floor. He wore a suit that cost more than her car. His hair was perfectly styled, and his smile was a weapon he wielded with casual cruelty. It was the same smile he used to charm juries and disarm business partners, but she knew its other side. She knew the tightness at the corners, the coldness in his eyes that the smile never reached. "There you are," he said, his voice a low growl that was meant to sound intimate but only sounded possessive. "I've been calling. Did you forget you have a husband?" Alara straightened up, slipping her phone into the pocket of her scrubs. She kept her own voice low, aware of the nurses and orderlies passing by, the tired families huddled on uncomfortable chairs. "Marcus, I was in surgery. You know I can't answer. Is everything all right?" "Is everything all right?" he mocked, his voice rising just enough to turn a few heads. "No, Alara, everything is not all right. Our joint account is overdrawn. Again. I had a rather embarrassing moment at lunch with the partners from Sterling Thorne. My card was declined." She closed her eyes for a brief second. The account was overdrawn because he had purchased a new watch, a celebratory gift to himself for a case he hadn't even won yet. She had seen the statement that morning. She had planned to transfer money from her personal savings, the small fund she secretly kept, her running fund as she grimly thought of it, to cover it before he noticed. She had been too slow. "I was going to handle it when I got home," she said, her voice a placating murmur. "It was an oversight." "An oversight," he repeated, savoring the word as if it were a particularly fine wine. He stepped closer, invading her personal space, forcing her back against the wall. He was a performer, and he needed his audience. "You have one job, Alara, one. You manage the house. You manage the finances. I make the money. That is the deal, and you can't even do that." Her chin lifted, a flicker of the woman she used to be, the woman who had graduated top of her class in law school before giving it all up to put him through his, sparked in her eyes. "Your deal seems to involve me paying for your $5,000 watches while I patch my own scrubs. The deal has changed, Marcus." It was the wrong thing to say. She knew it the moment the words left her mouth. She had broken the cardinal rule, never challenge him in public. His smile vanished, replaced by a mask of cold fury. His hand shot out, grabbing her upper arm, his fingers digging into the muscle like talons. "Let go of my arm," she said, her voice perfectly steady, belying the frantic hammering of her heart. "You don't talk to me like that," he hissed, his face inches from hers. "Not here. Not ever. You have forgotten your place." She did not scream. She did not struggle. She had learned long ago that resistance only made it worse. She simply stood there, a statue of quiet defiance, meeting his gaze. And that, his inability to make her cower, was what truly enraged him. The hand connected with her cheek. It was not a punch, but a slap. The sound was sharp, ugly, a crack that echoed in the acoustically pristine corridor. It was louder than the squeak of gurney wheels, louder than the distant, urgent chime of a code blue. For a moment, all other sounds ceased to exist, swallowed by the intimate violence of that single noise. Her head snapped to the side. A bloom of heat spread across her skin. She did not cry out. She simply turned her head back to face him, her eyes clear and cold. In them he could see not fear, but a finality that terrified him more than any scream ever could. A senior physician, Dr. Albright, a man whose portrait hung in the hospital lobby for his generous donations and his surgical prowess, chose that moment to step out of a nearby office. He was a man accustomed to authority, to being the most important person in any room. He saw the tableau, the furious, well-dressed man, the nurse with the bright red mark on her face. "What is going on here?" he demanded, his voice booming with self-importance. Marcus released her arm instantly. His entire demeanor shifted. The rage vanished, replaced by a mask of weary concern. He was a masterful actor. He ran a hand through his hair, sighed dramatically. "I am so sorry, doctor. My wife. She's had a long shift. She's overwrought. We were having a small private disagreement." Dr. Albright's gaze flickered from Marcus's expensive suit to Alara's simple scrubs. He made a calculation, a swift and brutal assessment of status and importance. The answer was obvious. He looked at Alara, his eyes filled not with concern, but with annoyance. Her pain was an inconvenience, a messy domestic drama cluttering his pristine hallway. "Nurse," he said, his tone dismissive. "Take your personal problems outside. This is a place of healing." "He struck me," Ilara said, her voice quiet but ringing with truth. Marcus laughed, a short, sharp bark of condescending amusement. He turned to the doctor, spreading his hands in a gesture of helplessness. "You see what I have to deal with? She's prone to hysterics. A wonderful nurse, I'm sure, but emotional. She's nobody, really. Just my overwrought wife. We'll be fine. I'll take her home." "She's nobody." The two words landed with more force than the slap. They erased her. They stripped away her competence, her identity, her very personhood. In that moment, she was not Ilara, the cardiac nurse who could hold a life in her hands. She was not the woman who had sacrificed her own ambitions for his. She was a non-entity, a problem to be managed. Dr. Albright nodded, satisfied. He had rendered his verdict. "See that you do," he said to Marcus, before turning his back on Alara and walking away. The dismissal was a kind of death. It was the final confirmation of a truth she had long tried to deny. She was utterly and completely alone. No one was coming to save her. No one would stand up for her. The system, the men in charge, they would always side with the man in the expensive suit. Marcus smirked, victorious. He reached for her arm again. "Now, let's go home and have a real discussion about your attitude." But before his fingers could touch her, a voice spoke from behind them. It was a low voice, almost a whisper, yet it cut through the corridor's ambient noise like a surgeon's scalpel. "I would advise against that." The words were calm. They were not a threat. They were a statement of fact delivered with the kind of absolute certainty that alters the gravity in a room. Ilara and Marcus turned. Standing in the doorway of a private suite, a room reserved for the hospital's most important patrons, was a man. He was not large or physically imposing, but his stillness was immense. He wore a charcoal suit of such perfect tailoring that it seemed less like clothing and more like a second skin. His black hair was cut with severe precision, and his eyes, dark and intelligent, were fixed on Marcus's hand, which was still hovering in the air near Alara's arm. He did not rush. He was not performing. He simply stepped out of the doorway and into the corridor, and with that single, unhurried movement, the entire dynamic of the scene shifted. Conversations down the hall faltered. A passing orderly slowed his pace, his eyes wide. Dr. Albright, who had only taken a few steps, froze mid-stride, a look of dawning horror on his face. He recognized the man. Or rather, he recognized the quiet, structural power that radiated from him like a cold front. This was Lee Jin-woo, the man whose family name was carved into the cornerstone of this very hospital wing. the CEO of a global conglomerate with interests so vast and shadowy they were the subject of whispered legends. To some, he was a brilliant businessman, to others, a phantom. To those who crossed him, he was the final word. Jinwoo's gaze lifted from Marcus's hand to his face. It was a neutral expression, yet it felt like a physical weight, a pressure that made the air thin and hard to breathe. He had seen the slap. He had heard the words. He had not updated the file on the situation. He had observed its creation from the beginning. "Let go of her," Jinwoo said. It was the same command Alara had given, but the effect was profoundly different. When she had said it, it was a plea for autonomy. When he said it, it was a redrawing of the laws of physics. Marcus, blinded by arrogance, failed to read the room. He was still playing to his perceived audience, Dr. Albright. "I'm sorry, who are you? This is a private matter between my wife and me." Jinwoo did not deign to answer the question. His attention shifted, landing on Dr. Albright with the soft click of a lock engaging. "Doctor," he said, his voice still quiet, yet now carrying a resonance that made the senior physician flinch. "Is it standard policy for your staff to be assaulted in the corridors of your facility?" Dr. Albright turned pale. The blood drained from his face, leaving behind a waxy, sallow sheen. "Mr. Lee," he stammered, his voice suddenly thin and reedy. I was not aware of the full situation. I can assure you, you were aware that a man struck a woman," Jinwoo interrupted, his tone glacial. "You were aware that she is a member of your staff, and you were aware that you did nothing. You chose to accept his version. You updated the file incorrectly." Two other men materialized behind Jinwoo. They had not been there a second before, yet now they were, as if summoned from the shadows themselves. They were dressed in dark, simple suits, their faces impassive, their posture relaxed, but radiating a coiled potential for swift, efficient action. They were men who existed to solve problems before they became problems. Jinwoo's gaze returned to Marcus, who was finally beginning to understand that he had made a catastrophic miscalculation. The world he knew, a world that bent to his will and his charm, was cracking at the seams. "You need to leave," Jinwoo said to him. Marcus sputtered, his bravado crumbling into blustering panic. "You can't. She's my wife." "She is a nurse at this hospital," Jinwoo corrected him calmly. "And you are a guest who has overstayed his welcome." He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod to the men behind him. They moved without wasted motion, one on each side of Marcus. They did not grab him violently. Their hands simply rested on his arms, a touch that was somehow both light and immovably heavy. The fight went out of Marcus instantly. He was a bully, and like all bullies, he was a coward at his core. He understood superior force when he felt it. "My briefcase," he stammered, looking at the leather case he had dropped. The man on his right, a man with a thin scar above his eyebrow, bent down, picked it up, and handed it to him with the polite detachment of a hotel concierge. Then they escorted him away. They did not drag him. They simply walked, and he was compelled to walk with them, his expensive suit suddenly looking cheap and ill-fitting, his swagger gone, replaced by the shambling gait of the utterly defeated. The corridor was silent. The few onlookers quickly found reasons to be elsewhere. Dr. Albright looked as if he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. He opened his mouth, then closed it, and with a pathetic, strangled noise, scurried back into his office. The chaos was gone. The noise, the tension, the humiliation. It had all been excised with surgical precision. All that remained was Alara, the faint, stinging heat on her cheek, and Lee Jinwoo, who stood before her in the ringing silence. He looked at her, his dark eyes holding an expression she couldn't quite decipher. It wasn't pity. It was something quieter, something closer to recognition. He did not touch her. He did not offer platitudes or apologies for the scene. He simply created a space of profound and unnerving calm. "There is a private lounge at the end of this hall," he said, his voice returning to its normal, low cadence. "Please, come with me. You should sit down." He led the way, his steps measured and unhurried. Ilara followed, moving as if in a dream. Her mind was a maelstrom of shock, fear, and a strange, disorienting flicker of relief. She felt as though she had been drowning for years, and a hand had just reached through the surface of the water, not to pull her out, but to still the storm around her, granting her a single, precious moment to breathe. The lounge was a space of quiet luxury. Muted colors, soft leather chairs, a single perfect orchid on a low glass table. It was a room designed to insulate its occupants from the raw, messy reality of the hospital beyond its soundproofed walls. Jin Woo gestured to one of the chairs and she sank into it, her legs suddenly feeling weak. He moved to a small, concealed bar and poured a glass of water, placing it on the table beside her. He did not sit too close, taking the chair opposite her, granting her a respectful distance. He did not press her to speak. He simply waited. The silence he offered was a physical thing, a soft, heavy blanket that settled over her, muffling the sharp edges of her panic. The kind of silence that doesn't echo, the kind that settles. After a long moment, her hands still trembling slightly as she held the cool glass, she found her voice. "Thank you," she whispered. The words felt inadequate, flimsy. He gave a slight inclination of his head. "It was the necessary course of action." "You didn't have to," she said, looking up at him, really seeing him for the first time. He was younger than she had first thought, perhaps in his late 30s. There were no lines of stress or worry on his face, only a profound stillness, as if he existed at a slightly different, calmer frequency than the rest of the world. "You don't know me." A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of his mouth. "That is not entirely accurate, Nurse Ilara. I feel as though I have known you for 3 months." Her brow furrowed in confusion. "I don't understand." "My grandmother," he said simply. "Park Soo-jin, room 412. The name clicked into place. Mrs. Park, the elderly woman in the private suite, recovering from a complicated heart surgery. A formidable woman with sharp eyes and a wit to match, who had been his patient for the entire spring. She was demanding, often cantankerous with the other staff, but she had taken a strange liking to Ilara. Ilara had found herself drawn to the old woman's fierce spirit, which reminded her of her own grandmother. She had spent hours in that room, long after her shifts had ended, reading to her, listening to her stories of old soul, brushing her long silver hair. She did it not out of duty, but out of a genuine connection, a moment of peace in her otherwise tumultuous life. "Mrs. Park is your grandmother?" Ilara asked, stunned. "She is," Jinwoo confirmed. "For the past 3 months, she has spoken of little else but the nurse with the kind hands and the sad eyes. She told me you taught her how to play chess again. She said you found an old recording of her favorite singer, a voice she had not heard in 50 years. She told me," he paused, his gaze direct and unwavering, "that you have a gift for mending things that are not broken, only bruised." Ilara felt a flush of color rise to her cheeks. She had never imagined those small acts of kindness were being reported, filed away. She had simply been doing her job, being herself. "She is a wonderful woman," Ilara said softly. "She's very strong." "She is," he agreed, "and she is an excellent judge of character, which is why I was here tonight. I was in her room, finalizing her discharge papers, when I heard the disagreement in the hall." He had heard everything, the accusation about the bank account, the lie about her hysterics. He had heard Marcus call her a nobody, and he had chosen to intervene, not as a stranger, but as the grandson of a woman whose life she had touched. The realization was dizzying. "You will not be going home tonight, Ilara," he said. It was not a question or a suggestion. It was a decree. "Your husband will not be returning to your shared residence. My men will ensure that." Panic, sharp and reflexive, pierced through her shock. "I can't just leave. My things, my job. I have nowhere to go." The practicalities of escape, the logistics of survival, were a wall she had never been able to scale. He seemed to anticipate her every fear, addressing each one with calm, logistical precision. "A car is waiting for you at the private entrance. It will take you to one of my properties. a penthouse in the city. You will be safe there. My assistant, Mr. Kim, is a very efficient man. He will arrange for your personal effects, and only your personal effects, to be collected from your home within the hour. As for your job," he added, a flicker of something cold in his eyes, "I will be having a conversation with the hospital board tomorrow morning. Your position here is more secure than Dr. Albright's. That is a guarantee." It was too much. It was too fast. A life dismantled and reassembled in a matter of minutes by a man she did not know. It felt like being swept up in a current, powerful and inexorable. "Why?" she asked, the single word encompassing a universe of questions. "Why this trouble? Why this generosity? Why me?" "My grandmother is very precious to me," he said, as if that explained everything. "She believes you are a person of substance and character. I have learned to trust her instincts. She would be displeased if I allowed a person she values to come to harm. Consider it a debt being paid." He stood, the motion fluid and decisive. He placed a slim, featureless black phone on the table. "This is for you. My number is the only one saved in it. Mr. Kim's will be added. It is secure. You will need nothing else for now." She stared at the phone. It was a lifeline and a cage all at once. She thought about Marcus, about his rage, about the look on his face when he realized she was gone. She thought about the years of quiet endurance, of shrinking and apologizing, and she thought about the two words that had finally broken her. "She's nobody." Lee Jin-woo did not see a nobody. He saw his grandmother's protector. He saw a problem to be solved with overwhelming logistical force. He saw a person of substance and character. She looked up at him, her decision made in the silent space between one breath and the next. The fear was still there, a cold stone in her gut, but for the first time in a very long time, it was accompanied by something else. A fragile, terrifying sliver of hope. "Okay," she said. The penthouse was less a home and more a statement. It occupied the entire top floor of a sleek obsidian tower that pierced the city skyline. The walls were glass, offering a panoramic, godlike view of the sprawling metropolis below. The furniture was minimalist, expensive, and looked as though it had never been touched by human hands. It was a space of absolute safety and profound isolation. It was beautiful, and it was sterile as an operating theater. For the first 3 days, Alara did little more than exist within its silent, climate-controlled confines. She slept in a bed larger than her old apartment's living room, the sheets a thread count so high they felt like water. She showered in a bathroom carved from a single slab of gray marble. She ate meals that appeared at precise times, delivered by a silent staff who moved through the apartment like ghosts, never making eye contact. It was a gilded cage, and she paced it like a restless animal. She was used to being the agent of her own life, the caregiver, the problem solver. This passivity was a garment that did not fit. She was being handled, managed with the same cool efficiency as one of Jin-woo's corporate acquisitions. She felt a surge of resentment, a hot flash of anger at being a damsel in distress, followed immediately by a wave of guilt. She was safe. Marcus could not find her. She had to remember that. This disorienting luxury was the price of a safety she had been unable to secure for herself. On the 4th day, Mr. Kim arrived. He was a man who seemed to have no sharp edges, dressed in a perfectly tailored gray suit, his demeanor one of polite, unbreachable professionalism. He carried a tablet and several boxes. "Good morning, Miss Alara," he said with a slight bow. "Mr. Lee asked me to oversee the transition of your personal assets." The corporate terminology was jarring, but she appreciated its lack of emotion. He was not here to offer pity. He was here to execute a task. He showed her the screen of his tablet. It displayed a detailed inventory of the contents of her former home. Her clothes, her books, her nursing school textbooks, the small wooden box where she kept her mother's jewelry. Every item had been photographed and cataloged. Beside each item belonging to Marcus was a red X. "These are the items we have collected and placed in storage for you," Mr. Kim explained. "We have also taken the liberty of closing your joint accounts and opening a new one in your name only. The funds you personally contributed have been transferred along with a severance settlement. Mr. Lee's legal team has already filed the initial divorce petition. Your husband has been served. It was breathtaking in its speed and finality, a life surgically excised. What did he do? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. He was resistant, Mr. Kim said, a master of understatement. But he complied once the new ownership of his apartment building was explained to him. Jin-woo hadn't just given her a safe house. He had taken Marcus's. The sheer scale of the power at play was difficult to comprehend. That evening, Jin-woo came to the penthouse. It was the first time she had seen him since the hospital. He brought with him not flowers or apologies, but 2 containers of takeout from a small, unassuming Korean restaurant in the city's West End. My grandmother says their sundubu jjigae can cure most ailments, he said, setting the food on the large, empty dining table. She insisted. They ate in a comfortable silence, the city lights twinkling below them like a fallen constellation. He did not ask her how she was feeling. He did not bring up Marcus. He asked her about her work, about the challenges of cardiac nursing. He listened with an intensity that was almost unnerving. He seemed to be collecting data, analyzing her responses. You mentioned once to my grandmother that you had wanted to be an architect, he said, changing the subject abruptly. Ilara was startled. It was true. Before law school, before Marcus, her dream had been to design buildings, spaces that healed, that calmed, that inspired. She had filled sketchbooks with designs. She'd hidden them away years ago. That was a long time ago, she said, a little defensively. He didn't press, but the next day, a large, professional-grade drafting table was delivered to the penthouse, along with a complete set of architectural pencils, rulers, and reams of high-quality paper. There was no note. There didn't need to be. It was a quiet invitation, an offering of a tool to reclaim a piece of herself she thought she had lost forever. Hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence, she began to draw. She sketched houses with wide windows and hidden gardens. She designed a library with soaring ceilings and quiet reading nooks. And then she began to design a hospital wing, a children's ward, a space filled with light and color, with curved walls and rounded edges, a place designed not just for medical efficiency, but for the emotional well-being of its small patients, a place of healing. The work absorbed her. For hours at a time, she was not a victim, not a patient, not a project to be managed. She was an architect. Jin-woo continued his visits. They became a quiet routine. He would come in the late evening after his own long day was done. Sometimes they would talk. Sometimes they would just sit in silence, sharing a pot of tea, looking out at the city. She learned about him in fragments. She learned he had taken over the family conglomerate after his father's sudden death, transforming it from a traditional Korean chaebol into a global powerhouse. She learned that his quietness was not a lack of emotion, but a disciplined control of it. His power was not in outbursts or threats. It was structural, deep, and quiet. It was in the contracts he signed, the companies he acquired, the systems he controlled. He was dismantling Marcus's life, but he was doing it on paper, in boardrooms and court filings, a death by 1,000 precise legal cuts. He discovered, through Mr. Kim's meticulous research, the full extent of Marcus's deception. He found Ilara's old law school papers, her brilliant, insightful research on corporate liability law, and he found the articles and briefs Marcus had published under his own name, built almost word for word on the foundation of her uncredited work. He had not just abused her, he had stolen her intellect, her career, and built his own upon its ruins. He was working from a version of her that had never been accurate, a file he had corrupted from the very beginning. One evening, Jin-woo was looking over her sketches for the children's hospital. She had been explaining her theories on the psychological impact of architectural space on healing. "This is remarkable," he said, his voice holding a note of genuine admiration. "The flow of the space, the integration of natural light. You see the system, not just the components." "I just think a place for sick children shouldn't feel like a prison," she said simply. He looked at her, his gaze steady. My foundation is funding the construction of a new pediatric oncology center. The current architects are competent. They are not inspired. I would like you to submit a proposal." Ilara stared at him. "I'm not a licensed architect. I'm a nurse." "You are a designer," he corrected her gently. "Licensing is a matter of logistics. We can hire a firm to execute your vision, to handle the technicalities. But the vision, that must be yours." It was the most extraordinary thing anyone had ever said to her. He was not offering her a handout. He was offering her a job, a position based on the competence he saw in her, a competence Marcus had tried so hard to erase. It was a recognition so profound it almost hurt. Their relationship was a slow, quiet burn. It was built not on romance, but on a foundation of mutual respect. He provided the safety and the resources, the unbreachable wall against the outside world. She, in turn, provided something he hadn't realized was missing from his own life: her warmth, her insight, her fierce, quiet intelligence. It was a challenge to his controlled, sterile world. She was recalibrating his understanding of strength. He had always seen it as control, as power over others. She showed him a different kind, the strength of endurance, of compassion, of creating beauty in the face of ugliness. She began to attend appointments with him, first for the foundation, then for his other businesses. She was introduced not as a girlfriend or a charity case, but as a design consultant. She sat in boardrooms filled with powerful men, and she was not intimidated. After years of navigating Marcus's moods, a corporate negotiation felt simple. She was precise, intelligent, and her insights were often devastatingly sharp. The men who initially dismissed her soon learned to listen when she spoke. She was no longer hiding. She was healing. She was building. Not just a new life, but a new version of herself, built from the salvaged pieces of the old, now assembled correctly, in the light. Meanwhile, Marcus was a man living in a house that was systematically being dismantled around him, brick by invisible brick. He had no idea who was doing it, only that his world was shrinking day by day. He lost his apartment first. Then, his biggest client, Sterling Thorne, unexpectedly terminated their lucrative contract, citing a strategic realignment after being acquired by a faceless international holding company. The partners at his law firm, smelling the stench of failure on him, began to shun him. His credit cards were canceled, his lines of credit frozen. His arrogance, however, was a fortress that reality could not easily breach. He did not see this as the result of a powerful enemy's strategic campaign. In his mind, it was all Ilara's fault. She had left him, and his luck had turned. It was a simple, narcissistic equation. He became obsessed with the idea that she had left him for another man, a wealthy man who was now exacting some kind of petty revenge. He could not conceive of a power so vast and impersonal that it would dismantle him for sport. It had to be personal. It had to be about him. "Give her 3 days," he had boasted to a colleague after she first disappeared. "She'll come crawling back. She can't survive without me." 3 days turned into a week, then a month. His bravado curdled into a venomous rage. He saw her not as a person who had escaped, but as a possession that had been stolen. His first move was a legal one. He was a lawyer, after all, and the law was his weapon. He filed a messy public divorce petition accusing her of abandonment, adultery, and emotional instability. He petitioned the court to have her assets frozen and filed a formal complaint with the state nursing board, claiming her erratic behavior made her a danger to patients. It was a scorched earth tactic designed to ruin her professionally and financially, to force her back to him out of sheer desperation. The response was not what he expected. Within 24 hours, his entire petition was countered by a team of lawyers from a firm so prestigious, so powerful, that Marcus had only ever read about them in legal journals. Their counterfiling was a document of breathtaking precision. It included detailed financial records proving his monetary abuse, sworn affidavits from neighbors who had heard his yelling, and, most damningly, copies of 3 separate emergency room visits Alara had made over the years for injuries she had claimed were from falling down the stairs or walking into a door. The complaint to the nursing board was dismissed the same day, accompanied by a letter of commendation for Alara from the chief of staff at the hospital, a letter Mr. Lee had, of course, arranged. Marcus was stunned. He was outgunned, outmaneuvered at every turn. He was an amateur boxer who had stumbled into the ring with a heavyweight champion he didn't even know was on the card. His legal strategy had not only failed, it had backfired spectacularly, painting him as a vindictive, abusive husband. Desperation began to set in. He hired a private investigator, a seedy man who operated out of a strip mall office. "Find her!" Marcus had snarled, throwing a pile of cash on the man's desk. "Find out who she's with. I want pictures. I want leverage." The investigator, as it happened, was competent. It took him 2 weeks, but he finally got a lead. He tracked Alara to a gala planning meeting for the Obsidian Fund, the city's most exclusive and high-profile charity organization. The fund was, to no one's surprise, the philanthropic arm of Lee Jin-woo's conglomerate. The investigator got a single grainy long-lens photograph of Alara leaving the meeting, deep in conversation with Jin-woo himself. When Marcus saw the photo, his world snapped into a terrible, flawed focus. Lee Jin-woo, the Phantom CEO, the man from the hospital corridor. It was him. In Marcus's twisted logic, this confirmed everything. Alara, his simple, foolish wife, had somehow managed to snag one of the wealthiest men in the country. She was a gold digger, a schemer. He wasn't the villain, he was the victim, the cuckolded husband. This delusion gave him a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't fighting a faceless corporation anymore. He was fighting a man, another alpha, and he was convinced he could win. He just needed the right stage. His gaze fell on the invitation to the Obsidian Gala that was still sitting on his desk, an artifact from his old life when he was still considered an important man. It was the city's premier social event, a place where fortunes were made and reputations were cemented. Lee Jin-woo would be there, and Alara, on his arm, would be his prize. Marcus saw his opening. He would crash the party. He would confront them in front of everyone, in front of the city's elite. He would expose Alara for the cheating whore he imagined her to be. He would humiliate Jin-woo, revealing him as a man who had stolen another man's wife. He believed, with the unshakable conviction of the truly arrogant, that he could win in the court of public opinion. He would shame her into coming back to him. It was a fatal miscalculation. He thought he was walking onto a stage of his own choosing. In reality, he was walking into a meticulously prepared trap, a legal and financial abattoir from which there was no escape. He was a fly, buzzing confidently toward the beautiful, patient web of the spider. The Obsidian Gala was held in the grand ballroom of the city's oldest and most venerated museum. The space was a symphony of soaring marble columns, vaulted ceilings painted with celestial frescoes, and the soft, golden light of 100 crystal chandeliers. The air hummed with the quiet murmur of immense wealth and power, the clinking of champagne flutes, and the distant, elegant strains of a string quartet. Alara stood beside Jin-woo near the grand staircase, a calm epicenter in the swirling galaxy of the city's elite. She wore an emerald green gown, the color of new life and deep water. The dress was architecturally precise, its clean lines and simple elegance a statement of confidence. She was not hiding. She was not a prop on a powerful man's arm. She was present, her posture poised, her eyes clear and observant. Tonight, she was not just a guest. Jin-woo was set to announce the Phoenix Children's Center project, and she would be introduced as its lead designer. Her name, her real name, was on the program. She felt a hand on her elbow, light and steady. It was Jin-woo. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice a low murmur meant only for her. She turned and gave him a small, genuine smile. "I am." And it was the truth. The fear that had been her constant companion for so long was gone, replaced by a quiet, solid sense of rightness. She was in her correct place. Then She saw him. Marcus was standing near the entrance, a discordant note in the room's careful harmony. He looked wrong. His tuxedo was impeccable, but his face was flushed, his eyes overly bright with a combination of alcohol and manic energy. He was scanning the crowd, a predator searching for his prey, and then his eyes found hers. A flicker of the old, cold dread went through her, a phantom limb of a fear she no longer needed. Jinwoo felt the subtle tension in her arm. He followed her gaze and saw Marcus. His expression did not change. He merely gave her elbow a slight, reassuring squeeze. "It's handled," he said softly. He had known Marcus would come. He had, in fact, counted on it. The ticket Marcus had leveraged his last favor to acquire had been facilitated by a broker on Jinwoo's payroll. Marcus began to push his way through the crowd, his movements clumsy and aggressive. People turned, their expressions a mixture of annoyance and curiosity. He was making a scene, just as Jinwoo had predicted. He finally reached them, his breath smelling of stale champagne and desperation. He ignored Jinwoo completely, his furious gaze fixed on Alara. He reached out and grabbed her arm, his grip tight and punishing, a grotesque echo of the assault in the hospital corridor. "We need to talk," he slurred, his voice loud enough to make the nearby conversations falter. "You can't just run away. You have an obligation to me. You are still my wife." The string quartet faltered, a single violin screeching into the sudden, heavy silence. Every eye in the grand ballroom turned towards them. This was the moment Marcus had wanted, his public stage. Alara looked down at his hand on her arm, then back up at his face, her expression one of cool disdain. "Let go of my arm, Marcus." Before he could respond, Jinwoo moved. He did not shove or shout. He simply stepped forward, interposing his body between Marcus and Alara, breaking the physical connection. He held up a single, calming hand to his security detail, who had begun to converge, their movements swift and silent. He would handle this himself. He turned to Marcus, his face a mask of polite, unreadable calm. "You are mistaken on several points," he said, his voice quiet, yet it carried across the silent ballroom as if amplified. The entire room held its breath. "First," Jinwoo began, his tone conversational as if explaining a minor contractual clause, "she is not your wife. The divorce was finalized by a judge at 4:15 p.m. today. The final decree was expedited due to the compelling evidence of gross misconduct presented by my legal team. Your petition was dismissed with prejudice. Ours was granted. The terms, I believe you will find, are exceptionally unfavorable to you." Marcus's face, which had been a mask of righteous fury, began to slacken with confusion. "What? That's not possible." "Second," Jinwoo continued, ignoring him, "she has no obligation to you. You, however, have a great many to me. For instance, the outstanding debt of your law firm, which my holding company acquired from the bank last Tuesday. It has been called in. Full payment is due tomorrow." A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. Marcus's partners, who were standing across the room, exchanged panicked glances. "And the lease on your office building," Jinwoo added thoughtfully. "I now hold that as well. It has been terminated, effective immediately due to a breach of the morality clause. Your assault on a hospital staff member, as it turns out, was a matter of public record." Marcus's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The color was draining from his face, leaving it a pasty, sickly gray. "Then there is the matter of your largest client, Sterling Thorne," Jinwoo went on, his voice relentlessly calm. "A fine company. My conglomerate completed the acquisition of their parent corporation yesterday. All of their legal contracts, including yours, are now under review. I can tell you now, they will be found wanting." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. He then pulled his phone from his pocket, the same slim, black device he had given Alara. He tapped the screen and held it up for Marcus to see. It showed a stock portfolio, a graph in a catastrophic vertical dive. "And finally, your personal investments," Jinwoo said, his voice dropping to an almost gentle whisper. "Managed, I see, by the firm of Dalton and Finch. A respectable house. I've owned them for 6 years. Your portfolio was over-leveraged. It has been reallocated to cover a portion of your new debts. The swagger, the arrogance, the entire carefully constructed facade of Marcus Thorne, successful lawyer and man of importance, collapsed in on itself in a single, silent implosion. The file was updated. The man he had pretended to be was erased. All that was left was the hollow shell. He stared at the phone, then at Jin-woo, then at Alara, his eyes wide with the dawning, annihilating horror of total ruin. He had nothing. He was nothing. He was, finally and completely, a nobody. A terrible, keening sound escaped his throat. He dropped to his knees on the cold marble floor. The man who had built his life on performance gave his final, most honest one. He began to beg. He started to sob. Great, racking, ugly gulps of air, his body shaking uncontrollably. It was a complete and public disintegration. Jin-woo watched him for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he gave a subtle nod. The security team moved in, efficient and discreet. They lifted the weeping, broken man to his feet and escorted him out of the ballroom, his pleas echoing behind him until they were cut off by the closing of the grand doors. The silence he left behind was absolute. In the profound hush that followed Marcus's removal, Jin-woo turned to Alara. The entire room, filled with the city's most influential people, seemed to vanish. His focus was entirely on her. He gently took her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "Are you all right?" he asked again. She looked up at him, and a slow, real smile spread across her face, reaching her eyes for the first time in what felt like a decade. A single tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek, but it was not a tear of sadness or fear. It was a tear of release. The immense, crushing weight she had carried for years, the burden of his anger, his cruelty, his casual dismissal of her worth. It was gone. The file was closed. The account was settled. "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I am now." The moment was broken by the sound of a single person beginning to clap. It was an old woman in the front row, her silver hair coiled in an elegant bun. Park Soo-jin, Jin-woo's grandmother, looking regal and fierce, her sharp eyes gleaming with pride. Then another person joined in, and another, until the entire grand ballroom erupted in thunderous applause. It was not for the drama. It was for her. It was an acknowledgement of her survival, her grace, her quiet strength. Later, when the time came for the evening's main address, Jin-woo walked to the podium on the stage. The room fell into a respectful silence. He spoke briefly, thanking the donors, outlining the mission of the Obsidian Fund. Then he paused, his gaze sweeping the room until it landed on Alara. "Tonight," he said, his voice resonating with quiet authority, "I also want to introduce the visionary who will be shaping the future of our foundation's most ambitious project to date, the Phoenix Children's Center." He looked directly at Alara, his voice softening. For too long, her brilliance has been an uncredited asset, her insights the silent foundation of another's success. She has been the most capable person in every room she has ever been in. It is a privilege to finally see her in a room that is worthy of her. He extended a hand towards her. "Ladies and gentlemen, the lead designer and chief architect of the Phoenix Project, Miss Alara Vance." It was her vindication, not as a victim who had been rescued, but as a professional whose competence was being publicly and unequivocally declared. As she walked toward the stage, the applause washing over her, she felt the last vestiges of Marcus's shadow burn away in the warm, bright light. She was not his overwrought wife. She was not a nobody. She was an architect. She was herself. She took Jin-woo's offered hand and stood beside him, not behind him, as his equal. Much later, they stood on the terrace of the penthouse. The city lights spread out below them like a carpet of scattered jewels. The cool night air felt clean, fresh. The distant sounds of traffic were a muted, peaceful hum. The silence between them was no longer a space to be filled, but a shared comfort, a language they both understood. He had not let go of her hand. It was not a gesture of ownership or passion, but of steady, quiet partnership, a connection between two people who had seen the truth of each other. My grandmother called while you were speaking with the museum curator, he said, his voice a low rumble beside her. She was insufferably pleased with herself. Alara laughed, a sound that felt new and liberating in her own ears. She has every right to be. Did she have any critiques of my speech? Only one, Jin Woo said, a hint of dry wit in his tone. She felt you were too humble. She also wanted to know if you would have dinner with us on Sunday. She has questions about the load-bearing capacity of the atrium design. Tell her I will be there, Alara said, her heart feeling impossibly light. And tell her I'm bringing the blueprints and dessert. He turned to face her, his dark eyes searching hers in the soft glow of the city lights. He saw no fear there, no sadness, only a calm, resilient strength that he had recognized from the very beginning. He had not saved her. He had simply provided the conditions for her to save herself. He had opened the door. She was the one who had been brave enough to walk through it. This was not a fairy tale ending, a passionate crescendo. It was something quieter, deeper, and more real. It was the peaceful, steady beginning of what comes next. A future to be designed and built together. A partnership founded not on obligation or necessity, but on the daily choice to stay. A family built from honesty, complication, and a shared, profound respect. Looking out at the endless expanse of the city, at the infinite points of light, Ilara finally let out a breath she felt like she had been holding for her entire adult life. She was safe. She was seen. She was home.